Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here tonight. I would like to thank the North Jersey Public Policy Network for their invitation. I also would like to extend a special note of appreciation for Rhoda because she had made every effort to accommodate my crazy schedule and other demands. I also would like to thank David for giving me a great ride from my classes to here. Thank you guys, and thank you everybody for having the time to come and join us for this conversation tonight. Well, as Omar has just started talking about Iraq and the centrality of Iraq in the region of the Middle East, I think that as a person in academia, I would not imagine thinking about the Middle East without the centrality of Iraq at its heart. Meaning, I cannot think of Saudi Arabia or of Israel or of Palestine or of Syria without thinking about the major role that Iraq has been playing since the mid 19th century until the early 20th century. Now, we're talking about, 20th century until now. I'm just like a little bit tired. Numbers are not resonating now with me. However, so if I want to think of the region in and of itself, I have to locate Iraq at the heart of that region. And I would like to make my own proposition about no, I'm not going to take it out. I just want to close it, yeah. So I would like to locate the region itself with Iraq at its center in a regional and international network in order to understand how the history of that region has been formed. More importantly for me as a researcher and as somebody who is engaged in a theoretical and a political work to conceptualize the whole region historically in order to understand why we got here in terms of all the development that Omar has presented a little bit ago. So I would like to talk about a regional network, and then I would like to target an international network in order to see what kind of future do we have as long as in that region, as long as we maintain certain institutional and international alliances with the West and among ourselves as a regional system of power. So, first element I would like to look at is the history of that region. Iraq is specifically, as we have heard from my colleague Omar, is pretty much marred with a very deep culture of violence. Since the establishment of Iraq in the 20s, in the early 1920s, until now, Iraq has been one of the most problematic places in the Middle East and amounted towards the very end of the 20th century to become the spectacle par excellence. And that interaction among Iraqis themselves with their political regime, as well as between Iraq and its neighbors, pretty much was important in understanding not only the institutions of Iraq, but also the institutions of the region itself in general. So political and social formations of Iraq are pretty much deeply rooted in a history of in a culture of violence that is not only unique for Iraq per se, but it's a regional phenomena that has many different variables, or that many different variables had contributed to its emergence to stabilize the region the way we know of it until 2003, and then reworking on enforcing another form of stability that abides by old rules and that is being made by the coming together of certain old alliances. Now, the As a historian, first of all, and second, as a political scientist, I would like to refer to certain political practices in the region as I know of throughout a long research studying different institutions in Iraq and in other Arab countries. I would like to say that these variables that I've just started talking about pretty much had to do something with the history of colonial regimes in the Arab region and the way our institutions in that region were set up in the 40s, 50s, and 60s of the century. And then at the eve of decolonization, post-colonial regimes in that region, including the Iraqi regime, they had to address or grapple with so many different issues at the local, regional, and international level that amounted somehow to their failure in first fulfilling their generous promises their promises of generous social contracts with their citizens. That was the first failure. The second failure was their inability of carving up international alliances that brings back benefits to the Middle East itself, as opposed to traveling and running away capital from the area to other centers, mainly Europe and the United States. And then the only thing that these regimes succeeded in the post-colonial era, pretty much, is creating massive repressive apparatuses in their countries. And I'm talking about the strongest institution across the Arab regime, and for that matter, Iran, Turkey, and Israel. It's like a unique feature of the Middle Eastern political structure across the board, from the western part of the Middle East to the eastern part of the Middle East. So the majority of these regimes succeeded basically in neglecting and abusing minority rights and fulfilling some sort of political inclusions for these rights. And then the last, one of the most important issues that the Middle East is grappling with is oil politics. Now, oil politics is pretty much associated with all of the above. And I will add to the concept of oil politics and in its association with international alliances. And I will explain a little bit more on this specific issue. And then finally, the regional system itself, since its inception, early 20th century, we have witnessed regional powers, Arab states, competing with each other in order to achieve regional domination and hegemony and expand in terms of their, interests, political and economic interests, let alone the personality cults of these regions the moment they become regional leaders and they name themselves to be gatekeepers of Arab nationalism or Arab future. Now, I will not talk about all these variables because that will take me forever. I will choose two variables and I will explain my position on these, and I will let the stage for you later on to see how these variables can be thought about in terms of producing certain policy recommendations. If we want to actually change something, if that is still a possibility, and I hope it is still a possibility. But if we want to change something, how should we think about these two issues, and what is our position as observers, as citizens of a country that has been historically involved with Iraq and the region for the last 50 years, literally 60 years, right? 6 years. So I'm going to address oil politics, and I'm going to address regional competition in order to get towards a certain conclusions. Now, in terms of competition for regional hegemony, I'm talking about two sets of relationships in that region. The first one is somehow fading historical relationship. They don't function as they did during the 50s and the 60s of the last century. But the rest are still resilient, and they are still shaping not only the politics, the internal politics of Iraq, but the face of the Middle East at this point where we are talking here in this room. People are fighting there and trying to remake the political future and the dominant culture of the Middle East one way or shape according to their ideology and after their image. Now, the first set of relationship that I'm going to talk about is the Iraq-Egypt relationship during the 50s. And then the second one is Iraq-Syria relationship during the 60s and the 70s. And I will revisit the Iraq-Syria relationship currently. And then I will talk about Iraq-Iran during the 70s. And I will revisit very little because I'm not expert on Iran or Iranian politics. And then I will talk a little bit briefly also on the Iraq Gulf states relationship. And within each of these relationships, one state to another, a state-to-state relationship, we will find one European power or the United States dictating or shaping or retransforming or recreating somehow through the back door or the front door one or more of the major elements between these two countries. Now, for the Iraq-Egypt relationship, we're talking about during the post-colonial era, we're talking about a massive role that has been playing by the Egyptian leadership, specifically Jamal Abdel Nasser, in carving up the concept of pan-Arabism and a concept of socialist nationalism that attempted to break up with the history of Western colonization in that area. So as a result, the United States, Britain, and France were not very happy with the Egyptian leadership. However, Abdel Nasser had an unprecedented popularity of an Arab leader, given that he is one of the newest, and he was promoting a nationalist concept of Arab nation that is not separated by walls or borders. He gained a momentum during the 50s and early 60s. Now, but the antagonism of the West, Britain, France, and the United States, and the constant confrontation between Egypt and Israel led Nasser to pretty much shake hands with the previous Soviet USSR or previous Soviet bloc in general, with specific focus or specific investment in his relationship with the previous Soviet Union. Now, the moment the Warsaw Pact was signed between Egypt and the previous Eastern Bloc, the United States stepped in, and Iraq claimed the regional leadership to fight the Warsaw Pact, and they signed the Baghdad Pact, which brought together a number of countries, which are pretty much the line of countries that formed borders between the previous Soviet Union and the Middle East. Pakistan, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and surprisingly enough, Great Britain. Now, that agreement was signed in 1955, and it was a defensive organization, though the pact itself was described as a defensive organization to achieve some sort of political stability and to limit Russian or Soviet incursion in the region, and supported by the United States of America to spread the concept of market economy and some sort of intense alliances with the West. Now, the United States was never formally part of that pact. However, an official representative, American representative, attended the meetings of that pact in Baghdad, and it was funded. Almost 70% of the funding for Baghdad Pact came from the United States of America. And also, don't forget that at that time, Britain and France were fading as colonial powers, and the United States was taking over. Therefore, this was a very smart and strategic step on the side, from the side of the United States to do. However, the treaty concluded in 1959, and Iraq failed to achieve a regional leadership because Nasser at that point claimed the stage, and the continuous wars, the constant wars, 1956 war, 67 war, and then in a couple of years, 73 war with Israel, all of these looked at, made the Arab population look at that pact, the Baghdad Pact, as some sort of treason, some sort of betraying the post-colonial ethics by again reshaking hands with the previous colonial regimes. Therefore, part of it failed. Part of its failure was because of the populist vision of that pact, and the second part was funding issues and lack of dedication on the signatures of that treaty. Now, the second relationship is Iraq and Syria, and this is a different, totally different competition. Iraq and Syria are basically both regimes that were governed at some point in their history by the Ba'athist Party, and as historians historicize for the Ba'athist Party, it was theorized by two Arab nationalists. The first one is Michel Aflaq, and the second one is Salah al-Bitar, and both of them are Syrians. This is the original nationalist thought of Baathism. This is where it originated. And then different variations of Baathism spread between Iraq and Syria. Now, the two Ba'athist regime, which one of them disappeared as of 2003, and the other one is still fighting for its future existence, whether it's going to be eliminated or whether it's going to continue the fight against other rules or other enemies or oppositions. Now, the divergence between Iraq and Syria in their interpretation of the ideology of Baathism amounted to a totally different ideology in each of these two countries. Now, by 1963, the disagreement almost started. However, by 1966, the real break took place when a staged coup took place in Baghdad, and the Iraqi leadership accused the Syrian government with participation or participation in staging that coup. 1978, Assad and the Iraqi leadership tried to come back together and try to bridge the gap between both of them for the sake of the nationalist discourse. However, that attempt failed as the Iran-Iraq war erupted later on, and Syria, the Arab Syria, decided to side with the Persian Iran against the Arab Iraq. So the concept of Arab nationalism that was pretty much underlying concept under the Ba'ath ideology was shattered by the siding of Syria with Iran. But we might later on understand why Syria did so, because the Ba'ath regime pretty much, or the Ba'ath regime in Syria accused the Ba'ath regime in Iraq of bringing the Syrian opposition that pretty much opposed the new Syrian regime to Iraq, and one of the major leaders was brought to Iraq, and he was protected under the Ba'athist regime of Iraq, and the other one was assassinated in Paris by Syrian mukhabarat officers, or by Syrian mukhabarat officers. Now, moving from here, we're talking about Iraq-Iran. As everybody knows in this room, Iraq has went to war with Iran for 8 years, from 1980, right? From 1980 to 1988, late 88. Now, the somber economic, political, and social effects of that war on the Iraqi community was ineffable. Almost every single aspect of the Iraqi state, the Iraqi culture, the Iraqi institutions, the community, the educational system, economy, everything was falling apart. Now, what do? We gained some stuff, some items during the war, and these two items, now we need to cash them back, because of the devastation, the massive devastation that took place in the Iraqi community. Now, the alliance with the United States was a very strategic alliance on that the Iraqi regime, or Saddam's regime at that point, managed to acquire during the war, and the alliance with other Gulf states. Basically, Iraq emerged as the most powerful, politically, as the most powerful regime in the area, conquering one of the most powerful Middle Eastern nations. However, the discourse, there was no real victory there. I mean, it's just a political maneuver. It's a political strategy to pretty much re-legitimize yourself as a political regime within your community. Now, as a result of this discourse, the Iraqi regime presented itself as emerging the most victorious and most powerful regime in the Arab area. It also claimed during the war itself as the gatekeeper of the Arab Eastern entry to the Arab world. So it cashed that gatekeeper status from the Gulf states in terms of checks and endless fundings, in order to protect the eastern border of the Arab world against the Shia enemy. Now, of course, Saddam was playing on the identity politics at that time, trying to get more funding from other Gulf states. And also, at that time, the United States of America was not opposed to that funding. Therefore, it was much easier to get it from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, and other Gulf countries. Now, by the end of the war, this power, or this feeling of power, was pretty much misinterpreted by the Iraqi regime. What do we do now to solve our problems? As Omar has just mentioned, we go to Kuwait in order to, first of all, achieve one of our old goals, which is bringing back Kuwait to Iraq, because we have always claimed that Kuwait is a part of Iraq's territory. That's number one. And number two, if we put our hands on the oil resources of Kuwait, that would alleviate the majority of Iraq's financial problems. It will enable the regime to rebuild a social network through which the regime can regain legitimacy, and therefore we're good. We don't have to worry about the consequences of our relationship with Iran, or the 8-year war. Now, unfortunately, the Arabs took the gatekeeper status from Saddam's regime. Checks from Riyadh, Doha, and other Gulf capitals stopped abruptly. And also, the United States of America played a dirty game with the Iraqi regime and fooled him into a trap of Kuwait. Now, of course, that does not mean that the Iraqi regime was not aware of that trap. That means that the Iraqi regime exaggerated or miscalculated its capacities and did not go as far as to propose a coalition, an international coalition against the Iraqi army alone or single-handedly in Kuwait. Now, and also on the other side, the American aids and the advanced military technologies that used to come to Iraq in forms of scientists, in forms of raw material, stopped. By the end of the 80s, Iraq experienced an abrupt cut off from every single privilege that it used to get from the United States of America throughout its war with Iran. Now, the occupation of Kuwait, as I said, was an attempt to pretty much alleviate Iraq's problems, economic as well as social, because if you fix the economy, then you reduce a lot of your social issues with the educational system and with the social relationships in terms of enhancing levels of income and creating some sort of growth in the country. Now, I want to revisit two of the histories that I just mentioned. The first one is Iraq-Syria. Post-2003, Syria managed or succeeded to transform itself into the center of attraction for foreign jihadists who crossed the borders from Syria to Iraq in order to fight. First, the Shia government of Iraq under the umbrella of Sunnism, and through their network and association with Al-Qaeda. And second, to destabilize any potential of emerging democracy in Iraq. So, the regime change ideology that was promoted by the American regime, and of course we know that a lot or a number of political regimes were listed under the George Bush's blacklist as the axis of evil, and Syria had a feeling that their turn is coming very soon. Therefore, they wanted to send a strong message to the American administration: we are not going to enable a peaceful transformation and establishment of institutions in Iraq because we are not going to be next. If this project succeeds in Iraq, that means it's going to be a dominoes effect. Now, this is the first thing. The allowance of thousands of mujahideens or jihadists, as CNN would like to tell them, to get into Iraq for several purposes. And then we're talking about the formation of a group that's called Nusra, that's formed the Syrian section of ISIS, and it transformed against the regime of Saddam al-Assad in a couple of years. In the beginning of 2007, that group started looking at the Syrian regime with an eye of revenge because the Syrian regime itself was not the nicest to the Islamic movement in Syria. However, in order to release the tension, Assad allowed them to go to Iraq, and he also issued a presidential pardon for a number of very serious political prisoners and allowed their free movement. And now pretty much Syria is paying back its bad deeds. The turn back of the Syrian ISIS, as well as Iraqi ISIS, and the cooperation over open borders right now is pretty much hitting the Syrian regime at the spine. Now, we're talking about the second case that I just started talking about is Iraq and Saudi Arabia. As Omar started talking about the differences, there are three major differences that one needs to look at when conceptualizing the animosity, the current animosity between the Saudi regime and the Iraqi regime. We're talking about a political aim, a long-term political game here. Who is going to be the regional power? Who is going to achieve a regional domination in the air? Especially, we're talking about an emerging Shia regime, as opposed to Saudi Arabia, who claims itself as the Sunni protector of faith. Now, therefore, we're talking about this is the ideological aspect of it. The political aspect of it is when we talk about a democracy, next door to Saudi Arabia, the most regressive theocratic regime, that is a great danger within the borders and outside the borders of Saudi Arabia. Think of the Shia population of Saudi Arabia, who is being underrepresented first and being marginalized and executed whenever anything goes on, anything wrong goes on in the political scene of Saudi Arabia. The points are fingered at the Shia population. And lastly, financially, we are talking about the second largest oil producer in the region after Saudi Arabia. So if you let Iraq thrive, you are pretty much having to work out an economic deal with Iraq, because if you keep dominating the market as the largest producer of oil, you secure a lot of items for your population, and you engage the majority, not the majority, but the citizens of Saudi Arabia, and citizenship here is very exclusionary in the Gulf state countries. You engage them with a luxurious lifestyle at the account of the other populations of the region. So let the other nations go to poverty, while Saudi Arabia is still managing to make some good benefits from its deals with the United States of America, cheap oil, hitting Russia at some point, and destabilizing Iraq's income from this resource as one of the major resources for Iraq, financial resources of Iraq right now. Now, I would like to move from the political aspect to oil politics as we want to think about it in academia. I don't want to think about the price of oil. I don't want to think about who gets access by force or by smuggling. I want to think about a network of actors engaged in a project of distribution of commodities. There is demands and there is pretty much, what do we call it? Supply and demand. Sorry, it's been a very long day. There is supply and demands, and there are political alliances engaged in the middle. So let's look at the concept of newly emerging political regimes in the Middle East, and link that newness or these emerging political units to another space, which is Europe, and link Europe to a third space, which is the United States of America. Let me explain what I mean by this network that links the Middle East with Europe with the United States. US planners, after the decolonization, the majority of the Arab countries at that point, in the 50s after the Second World War, were decolonized or in their way of decolonization. The establishment of national regimes created a new set of institutions in this region, and those sets of institutions, they had high political goals to achieve between the 50s and the 90s of the century. However, how do we undermine these goals? How do we create initial problems so we can create some sort of domination, political and economic domination on this region? We have to connect Europe and the Middle East through one thing, and this one thing is oil. And this oil is going to create a European dependency on the United States and an Arab dependency on the United States as well. The United States is going to be controlling all the major resources of oil in the region. Now, the first step was to pretty much secure deals with national regimes or with local regimes, regardless whether they're post-colonial, national, or just an old oligarch theology as in Saudi Arabia. The second step was look at Europe after the Second World War and transform its economy from one that is coal-based into one that is oil-based. Now, how do we do this? Europe, or Western Europe, does not have oil. So we will think about the current constructed pipelines in the Middle East, and we will prolong them and think of connecting them to Europe. Therefore, all the construction, rare, scarce construction steel material that was shipped from the United States to rebuild Europe was redirected to the Middle East in order to build the pipelines. And also funds from the Marshall Plans, from the Marshall Plan that was supposed to arrive to European reconstruction project went straight to Saudi Arabia in order to construct a new pipeline that might, I will show you a map for this pipeline, that might actually work hand in hand with the current pipeline that still exists in Iraq from the British days. Now, but this pipeline needs to be US controlled. We have to make sure that we construct a deal with each of these national elites somehow by giving them more privileges or by offering certain protections or you name it. Now, the first pipeline that existed in Iraq before was the Kirkuk-Haifa pipeline. And you imagine it stretches from the northern side, the northern area of Iraq, the Kurdish area that we know right now, all the way to modern-day Israel proper, which was at that time Palestine. And then there is a conceptualization of a new pipeline that does not end in Israel, but that goes all the way through the Mediterranean in order to directly feed the European market. Now, that was a little bit an ambitious plan. They had to stop at the Mediterranean by Israel or Lebanon or Syria at some point, and they could not continue doing it the way it was planned initially. Now, This is the first, the Kirkuk, northern Iraq, all the way to Jordan, to Israel originally, to end here. That was 1940, between 1940 and 1950. However, the situation or the war between the Arabs and the Jews took Haifa port as its major target point, and the United States of America had to rethink of the Saudi pipeline that originated here and went through the all around the Iraqi borders all the way to Jordan, and to redirect it to Lebanon to avoid the confrontation between the Jews and the Arab population of that region. Now, throughout this process, initially this was supposed to stop here and connect here because you save all the expenditure that you have to put building the rest of the pipeline, and then it goes on. Now, after the British failed in controlling Palestine, the political situation in Palestine, and they declared that they are going to terminate their mandate, the Americans knew that this is not working. So they targeted Syria and Lebanon, and they pretty much offered nothing in exchange. Nothing. Very little pennies. The Syrian regime at that time, of course, we're not taking this deal. It's an unfair deal. So give us a little bit better deal. The American administration refused. Then they went to the Lebanese regime at that time, and the Lebanese regime is pretty much was more divided given the sectarian identity of the regime. The prime minister refused, the Lebanese prime minister refused the American offer to construct the end or the port of that pipeline at Sidon. Yes, at Sidon. And he requested more returns, economic returns and political privileges with the United States. The United States refused and make a detour around the prime minister at that time and forced a deal on him through part of his political elites and close circle. Now, John Bullard was forced to accept the deal later on, and the line was constructed from Saudi Arabia all the way to Lebanon. Now, at this stage, while these pipelines were being constructed, oil workers were were trying to transform the political scene for their own benefits, like nationalization of oil politics. That was one of their demands. In Iraq, for example, the same thing in Saudi Arabia, the same thing in Iran, the same thing workers and students, activists and communist parties in Syria and Lebanon demanded in exchange of opening or extending the pipelines over the Syrian and Lebanese territories. Now, these demands went to deaf ears. And we will see in Saudi Arabia, for example, which was absolutely shocking, Aramco, the American company at that time, which was a consortium of 4 or 5 American oil companies under the name Aramco, was digging and exploiting the Saudi oil. Now, mid-40s to mid-50s, Saudi oil workers initiated a number of strikes. They demanded the termination of the concession rights, the American concession rights in the Saudi oil fields. They demanded enhancement of their working conditions, less working hours, higher wages, democratic constitution, both the workers and the monarchy abides by, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens? The security forces of Aramco identified the leaders of that strike that took place in 1956 and identified them to the Saudi regime. The Saudi regime eliminated that leadership, period. Half of them was deported, half of them was imprisoned for life. Nobody heard of them afterward. The racial construction of Aramco as a white company coming to Saudi Arabia, where the CEOs all were Americans and Europeans, and the labor who worked and excavated and built the refineries were Arabs and natives, was replicated now with Saudi citizens and regional workers, Egyptians, Syrians, Palestinians, and other nationalities from the Middle East. Now, the racial structure itself that is based on access to certain privileges were replicated now under the leadership of the Saudis. Now, the second case, which is in contrast to the Saudi case, is the Iraqi case. Oil workers, student activists, the Iraqi Communist Party were among the most sophisticated unions in the country, or in the region actually, more accurately. They forced the British government to reach a deal with them and to pretty much switch the line, that the pipeline that we have seen on the map so many times through blockage, stoppage of production, strikes, hitting the most vulnerable spots of oil production, refineries and ports, as well as continuous obstruction of pumping oil to Haifa. One of the more problematic ends was Haifa, but equally problematic and confrontational, and was not easy to rule and control throughout the space that line crossed, was the area in the middle of Iraq. It's a village that is called Shaduriya, and at this point it is well known. The historians recall it as Al-Wathba al-Iraqiyya, the uprising, and that was a huge hit to the British colonial regime at that time, which forced it to pretty much leave for the second time from Iraq. Now, in the real ways, the workshops at Shalashiyya, I apologize, were totally stopped, and Iraq as the only Middle Eastern country that had a functioning railway at that time, and then in the oil fields, all the refineries were blocked for between 10 to 15 days at a time at the purification points. That pretty much disabled the whole pipeline from Kirkuk to Haifa, passing through Jordan, and caused a lot of economic havoc for the British administration at that time. Now, we will look at the new plans for these pipelines. In 2003, In 2003, the Israeli Minister of National Infrastructure, according to Haaretz and the Middle East Economic Review, he announced that there are conversations between Tel Aviv and Washington, D.C. about reviving that line from Kirkuk to Haifa. And he also announced that his conversations with officials in Amman went very positive. Now, after 2003 and the emergence of the insurgency in Iraq and the incapacity of the northern part of Iraq to pretty much not normalize fully with Israel, nobody heard about that story after that. Like 2004 was the last time I heard or read anything about it, and I have not revisited the trauma so far, but I will do. But so far I don't know anything about that story to materialize. But in 2011, the most interesting element, which Omar just started talking about, we listened to very shocking news, and it's a leaked document basically that says Syria, the government of Syria, Iraq, and Iran are planning on building a new gas pipeline that I will show you the map. That extends from the Iranian territory here.
Take the mic with you.
So the gas pipeline is supposed to start from the Iranian territory here, cross through Iraq, and then end up in Syria. And perhaps the plan would be to include the Kirkuk gas oil fields, and this means from here, if you see Qatar and if you see Bahrain, and if you see the borders of Saudi Arabia, there is one of the major gas pipelines that travels here from Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, all the way to Turkey. direct to the European Union. Now, if you talk about an alternative, shorter, cheaper gas, and a huge amounts of gas. We're not talking about limited quantities that is able to invade the European Union markets. We're talking about very much a massive economic loss for this region. Now, given that condition, can I leave it now? I go back to my.
Yeah.
Oh, it's mine actually. Oh, I can claim it. Thank you. Now, given going back to the Syrian situation after 2003 and the enabling of the jihadists and opening the borders totally for any volunteer who wants to get inside Iraq, claiming that they are fighting under the Sunni identities, creating this false dichotomy of Sunni Shia, and providing the majority of finances for those jihadists, Saudi Arabia was in agreement with Syria. They basically provided the majority of economic aids for those international and Arab fighters, and after that, they provided them with rights of access through the borders to Saudi Arabia itself and training camps financed by Saudi Arabia in Syria. Now, the plan was you pretty much facilitate their access to Iraq, we finance them, and we destabilize the American the potential of an American-created democracy in Iraq, and we create Saudi Arabia, at least, we create a Sunni dominance because we're not going to allow this new Shia government to be a powerful and stable government. Now, if you go back, when Syria was very unhappy with Saudi Arabia for a secret deal that was made between the Secretary of the State and the King of Saudi to facilitate the striking or airstrikes against ISIS in the Syrian territory. Syria decided that, of course, after those fighters turned against Syria, Syria started fighting them. Now, once Syria started fighting them, Saudi Arabia decided that they will seal this secret deal with the United States government, facilitating airstrike financially, as long as the American government still enables them through one way or another, empowering those fighters in Iraq. So this is a very complex network. It is so difficult to point at the source of the problem, yet there are many sources that are identified. Now, how do we think of a future of the Middle East? This is what every political scientist, every area study specialist is trying to think about. I personally say that one of my main recommendations, if we ever think about a potential future generation that is gonna disengage with this culture of violence and killing and beheading and conspiracies, I think that we need a serious political plan from a powerful country like the United States. Now, by no means I'm referring to 2003 intervention. By no means I'm referring to the old colonial politics that pretty much repeats itself in the form of nation-building projects that, I am so frustrated with this concept of nation project or counter-insurgency nation-building project that materialized in the form of walls within Baghdad and other Iraqi cities. We actually need a serious discussion about what form of intervention the United States needs to be engaged in. Because at this point, I assume that there is no regional power. Things are laissez-faire in the Middle East. Politically, institutionally, and militarily. It's like there is an Arab proverb that it says like each one controls an alley and nobody controls the whole city. This is what's happening here. There is no vision whatsoever for a pact between neighbors or a pact within nations, whether the Syrian or the Iraqi nations. And in few years, we will hear about other incidents. People, other populations of the Middle East will invent their own categories. Something that we have not heard of yet, but it's coming. Now, so a serious intervention that every serious American citizen who would like to see this country doing a humanistic project as opposed to a colonial misconducted project in that region should be engaged at. This is one. Next, and the stabilization of the Middle East is actually an economic and cultural stabilization of the United States. If you are talking about a United States or a consumption of American citizen for a gallon of gas for $9, I asked my students this evening, how much do you buy gas in this country? They said like 1.5. I said, I know of a country where people buy the gallon for $9. Imagine if you have to provide $9 for a gallon of gas, and the consequences of that at almost every level of expenditure in your lives. Imagine this. We're going to become a third world nation. That is like, I'm not promoting some sort of self-interest discourse, but I'm promoting, a form of calculative discourse where, yes, I am interested in a humanistic form of intervention, one that does not bring the post-2003 counterinsurgency nation building project in Iraq, but a one that can actually counter all these forces that at this point neither the Iraqi government is capable of fighting, and I assure you, nor the Saudi government will be able to fight alone. So let's see. And I will conclude here, and I would welcome your thoughts and ideas. Thank you.